I'll be speaking to the events and the assault on the autonomy of Kashmir, which happened in 2019, and I'll be reading my comments. So just give me a moment to get the document in line. By August 4th, 2019, the Indian government had flown in 48,000 plus troops, on top of the 700,000 already occupying the region of Kashmir. With rumors rife, Kashmiris hunkered down for whatever was to come. People flocked to the markets for rations, medicines, baby food, and gas. Photograph of an old Kashmiri man stocking gas in a small plastic flask went viral. Living under a neo-colonial India's military occupation for 72 years, which has annihilated Kashmir's sovereignty, responding to the contingencies of a protracted and invisibilized war has become part of Kashmiri life. On 5th August 2019, the right-wing Hindu supremacist Bharatiya Janata Party government put into motion a multi-pronged military siege of Kashmir. Kashmir's quasi-autonomy, also known as the special status through the Article 370 and the accompanying Article 35A, were illegally removed by a rushed presidential decree. This without consulting the Kashmiris or the legislature that had been dismissed previously. India's own experts deemed this as an unconstitutional deed accomplished by deceitful means that could not be achieved unilaterally. An elderly Kashmiri man called it Chadhai, invasion, annexation mounted by India. Even though the Indian military power was supercharged with Hindu supremacist and nationalistic zeal, the government camouflaged it as integration to consolidate the Indian nation state. To all Kashmiris, it was an act of war. India's local client politicians in Kashmir, who have run the puppet governments for New Delhi since 1947, were also arrested and detained. Average civilians, resistance leaders, human rights defenders, lawyers, journalists, and business people were put under detention or house arrest. Towards the end of October, some detainees were being released in exchange of bonds, barring them from all political activity, especially speaking against the removal of autonomy. Many prisoners were booked under the Jammu and Kashmir Public Safety Act 1978, which Amnesty International calls the lawless law. The Public Safety Act allows the arrest and incarceration of people without charge or no trial for up to 2 years. The jails overflowed to the extent that the government planned to rent private properties to serve as detention centers. Mass arrests led to more than 13,000 incarcerations, including children. Many were imprisoned in jails outside Kashmir. Kashmiri journalists were barred from reporting. Initially, foreign reporters were allowed, but later they were banned from entering Kashmir, and reporting on Kashmir invoked the wrath of the Indian government. Around 8 million Kashmiris were under curfew, and an unprecedented communication lockdown was enforced on all forms of media, internet, landlines, and cell phones. Genocide Watch put out an alert on the region. A radio silence emanated from the valley. An Indian actor and a prominent BJP supporter, Anupam Kher, tweeted, "Kashmir solution has begun." It sounded ominous and a brazen nod to the final solution. Kashmiris saw the removal of autonomy as an attack on their ethnic, cultural, religious, and national identity, but the Indian government justified its actions with several strawman fallacies. They claimed that the autonomy had impeded Kashmir's development and its removal would tackle nepotism and quote-unquote terrorism. Terrorism is the labeling that Indian government conveniently puts on Kashmiri resistance to India. These arguments were even refuted by India's own experts as misleading and disingenuous. In some, they were political equivalent of gaslighting. It is a reasonable question to ask, if the removal was for betterment, then why were Kashmiris caged and not celebrating on the streets? Instead, Kashmiris lamented the removal of autonomy as a way to outright Indian settler colonialism, native dispossession, ecocide, extractive exploitation, and de-development. The military siege lasted several months, and in March 2020 was superimposed by the COVID lockdown. The humanitarian crisis in Kashmir at one point became so grave that the medical journal Lancet wrote an editorial. The Indian government adamantly, continuously claimed that the situation was normal, even when massive protests were erupting despite the curfew, with more than 100 injured and several killed. The economic loss inflicted on Kashmiris was upward of 5.3 billion USD, and it has continued with the local Kashmiris steadily being dispossessed. The Indian government also, in an unprecedented manner, downgraded the state of Kashmir to a union territory to be governed directly by an unelected nominee from New Delhi. The state was also hacked into two parts, Jammu and Kashmir and the province of Ladakh. This was essentially a divide and conquer policy. Indian government declared that the integration of Kashmir was complete. The word integration sounds benign to the international community, but its violence is marked on each Kashmiri body. It's a wound that never heals. For Kashmiris, integration means 72 years of political trauma and subjugation inflicted by India. It means democracy weaponized as politics with sham elections involving client politicians, collaborators, sellouts, and thugs. It means UN resolutions being sidelined. It means illicit elections, which the UN, when they were first held, deemed as out of order and have since been used as a farce of democratic governance, camouflaging a military occupation. It means that these very elections being rigged and manufacturing of consent by propping up predetermined client governments that favor India's hold on Kashmir. Kashmiris largely refer to 1947 disputed accession to India or the special status as a Jabri Nata, meaning forced relation imposed by the sole will of a defeated and fleeing Hindu monarch of the Kingdom of Kashmir, who was facing a large-scale Muslim rebellion. Under the term of special status, Kashmir became quasi-independent. India has jurisdiction over only matters of defense, currency, communication, and foreign affairs till the UN-mandated plebiscite would be held. Formalized through Article 370, Kashmir had its own constitution and flag. India needed consensus from the Kashmiri legislature in all matters pertaining to the state. The accompanying Article 35A ensured the territorial sovereignty of Kashmir, securing the right to employment, education, property ownership, and electoral franchise for the indigenous population. India weaponized the autonomy treaty to cultivate a section of client politicians and prepare ground to crack down on movements propagating Kashmiri resistance to India. The special status, while guaranteeing quasi-autonomy, essentially acted as a Trojan gift, enabling Indian laws and statutes to be juridically passed into Kashmir. The clientelist regimes helped the Indian government in eroding Article 370 through administrative, military, and judicial means. By August 2019, only a few symbolic parts and Article 35A of the original autonomy treaty remained in force. In the past, legal experts had observed that the removal of Article 370 would be a constitutional nightmare for India. Being the only mechanism that establishes Kashmir's status with its federation, its removal was also seen as next to impossible. The article was declared as a permanent feature of the Indian Constitution by the Supreme Court of India and the Kashmir High Court. Kashmir resistance leaders had long debated that ending Article 370 would automatically free Kashmir from Indian rule. Some Indian jurists also claimed that removing Article 370 would turn India's de facto occupation into a de jure one. But the BJP government did not desist from tampering its own constitution, ignoring all legal ramifications. It is well documented that across India, the BJP runs on an anti-minority agenda, and that the erasure of Kashmir's autonomy and dilution of its Muslim majority by way of settler colonialism has been one of its rallying cries. Currently in India, the ideology of Hindu indigeneity and supremacy, which casts Muslims living in India as invaders and foreigners, is on the upswing. Kashmiri Muslims are doubly marked as the demonized other, first as Muslims and second as Kashmiris who are fighting for their right to self-determination. While BJP executed the final removal of autonomy, the policies for its evisceration have long been active. In past, it was done through deft political, diplomatic, and juridical machinations using Kashmiri client politicians and not solely through military or broad tampering with the constitution. These policies became key in criminalizing Kashmiri resistance. Thus, BJP completed the plan which has been part of Indian neo-colonialist expansionist policy in Kashmir since inception. With all its shortcomings, Article 370 was a symbol of Kashmir's historical sovereignty and served to underwrite the demand for Kashmiri self-determination mandated by the United Nations. Kashmiris stood for Article 370 and 35A not in loyalty to the Indian Federation, but to protect their territorial sovereignty and keep Indian settlers at bay. But currently, India has unilaterally amended the domicile law to allow categories of Indian citizens to become domiciles of Kashmir. The process is fast-tracked and even penalizes authorities if there is any delay. Kashmiris attribute this urgency to India's demographic terrorism, which is facilitating speedy entry of the settler population. The demographic changes underway will alter the Muslim majority in the region. This policy aligns neatly with BJP's Hindu supremacist agenda, which is also causing an incremental genocide of Muslims in India. During the pandemic, Indian military also stepped up counter-insurgency operations despite the United Nations calling for cessation of all violence in conflict zones. As an ethical global community, we must perceive India beyond the stereotype of the largest democracy in Asia or ahimsa and yoga and recognize it as a Hindu supremacist necropolitical imperial power that is occupying Kashmir. We must ask India to comply with its international obligations towards UN-mandated right to self-determination of the Kashmiri people. India must immediately stop changing laws that impact Kashmir's demography, infrastructure, resources, and culture, thus complying with the international laws to protect disputed territories and its people. Indian government must immediately and unconditionally release all political prisoners, human rights defenders, journalists, and activists, and all resistance leaders. It must allow international humanitarian relief, media organizations, and UN observers to freely enter and observe Kashmir. We must seek an end to the Hindu supremacist settler colonial occupation of Kashmir now. Thank you so much.